Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Jenny Perlman Robinson, and I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you all here today for today's event focused on how do we expand and sustain quality learning for children and youth, scaling lessons from Cote d'Ivoire and Tanzania. The event will be simultaneously interpreted in French and English. So if you'd please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the globe icon to select your preferred language. If you want to go ahead and do that now, you can remain in that channel for the entire session. I'd like to begin by expressing my deepest gratitude to our Scaling Lab partners around the world who have generously and courageously allowed us to accompany and learn alongside them on their scaling journeys. These reports are the culmination of all of our joint work and really their tireless and laudable efforts. I'd also like to thank our funders, specifically the Jacobs Foundation, the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, UBS Optimus Foundation, ELMA Foundation, BHP Foundation, and the Global Partnership for Education, Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, a joint partnership between GPE and the International Development Research Center. This work would not be possible without your generous and flexible support. The activities supported by our donors reflect Brookings' commitment to quality, independence, and impact in all of our work. The views expressed here do not necessarily reflect those or represent those of any of these funders or the boards of directors. In terms of the agenda for the next hour, I'll begin by sharing some brief highlights from the two reports we recently published in collaboration with our partners in Cote d'Ivoire and Tanzania. And while I'll be the one presenting, I want to make sure to acknowledge my other co-authors on the report, Molly Curtis-Wise, Patrick Hanahan, and Christina Kwok. This will be followed by a moderated panel conversation with two leaders of the initiative in each country, Barbara Chalangwa and Fostan Kofi, to provide deeper insights on lessons learned to date about scaling the impact of these two innovative education approaches. We'll also be joined on the panel by two global thought leaders, Larry Cooley and Asif Salih, who will share their reflections on the relevancy of these findings to other contexts and systems. Finally, we'll turn to CUE Senior Fellow Brad Olson to provide some concluding thoughts and share some of the next steps for Millions Learning, this research effort to collaboratively learn more deeply about scaling impact in education, particularly in resource-constrained environments. Throughout the event, we encourage you to pose questions for the panelists and contribute to the conversation on Twitter at #MillionsLearning. And thank you to those of you who have already shared questions in advance. While we know we won't have time to get to all of those questions during the session, we'll try our best to follow up afterwards with responses. But first, I'm delighted to turn to our keynote speaker, the Honorable Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia, recent board chair of the Global Partnership for Education, CAM-Fed patron, and distinguished non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, to provide some introductory remarks.
I'm delighted to be joining you all today to discuss two new reports coming out of the Centre for Universal Education at Brookings in collaboration with many partners around the world. I hope it's not too long before we are all together in person again. These reports focus on the complexities of achieving sustainable scale in education, how to reach many more children and young people with quality learning opportunities, and in particular, how to reach those most marginalised and most in need. I certainly don't need to remind you that we have a global learning crisis, which has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, we all know this too well. Instead, I'd like to share some reflections on what is needed to move forward and make significant and lasting progress. The question of how to identify what is working and then expand it to reach many more children has been central to my work over the past few decades, as Minister for Education in Australia, then Prime Minister, and most recently over the past 7 years as Board Chair of the Global Partnership for Education. In each of these positions, I have had the privilege to be a part of or witness many innovative and impactful efforts working to ensure that more children are able to exercise their right to a quality education, which then in turn creates better opportunities for a healthy, safe and productive life. And while there is a lot we are learning as a global community in terms of what improves children's education, there is a lot more we still need to know about how to do so equitably and sustainably at large scale. In the past 7 years, the Centre for Universal Education, as part of the Millions Learning Project, has been investigating efforts to scale and sustain evidence-based education initiatives, leading to large-scale improvements in children's learning. Most recently, Brookings has done this through a series of real-time scaling labs in which we partner with local institutions to accompany and learn alongside their initiatives as they scale in real time. This helps us to identify and collaboratively address some of the challenges and enabling factors that contribute to sustainable change. I have been involved with Millions Learning from the start. I've supported efforts to close both the knowing and doing gap when it comes to scaling in education as an advisor and as a thought leader. And I would argue that closing this knowing and doing gap requires ongoing reflection driven by data to honestly and transparently analyse what is working, what is not, and what we've learned along the way. Therefore, I am delighted to be here today as we collectively learn from our partners in Tanzania and Côte d'Ivoire and their efforts to adapt and scale evidence-based initiatives to reach some of the most disadvantaged children and young people in their countries. While these studies are an in-depth examination of the experiences scaling two initiatives to date and highlight both the successes and challenges faced in these contexts, their application can be broader and potentially instructive to many of us grappling with similar issues in other contexts. The first theme that stands out to me from these two cases is the critical importance of timely and relevant data. This is useful to not only hold us accountable to ensure quality education, but also to continuously learn, improve and drive our decision making. The cases in both Tanzania and Côte d'Ivoire illustrate the benefits of a data-driven process to support scaling the impact of an education initiative with quick feedback loops and routine opportunities to make changes. At the same time, both cases underscore that this is easier said than done. Data-driven adaptation not only demands access to quality data, but also requires significant capacity and leadership to act on this learning. The realities of these capacity and institutional constraints and existing power dynamics cannot be ignored. Another theme emerging from these case studies is the need to mobilise long-term resources to fund sustainable delivery at large scale. Both cases highlight the real and significant challenges of this task, including constrained education budgets and projectised donor funding, but also an insight into steps that can be taken towards this goal. In Côte d'Ivoire, for example, they are experimenting with a pooled funding mechanism that brings together resources from government, philanthropy and the private sector to help scale access to quality education across the country. In Tanzania, they developed a costed scaling plan to inform next steps to experiment with joint delivery with the government in a few locations. While neither offer easy solutions, both cases emphasise how planning for the mobilisation of this funding cannot begin too soon. A final common theme to both case studies, which I personally feel very strongly about, is the necessity of putting local leaders in the driver's seat of change to ensure we do not just pay lip service to partnership and local ownership of solutions, but truly put this principle into practice as international education partners. In many ways, this was the impetus behind the real-time scaling labs, which Brookings tested in both case studies. While CUE has been involved in documenting, learning from and supporting these efforts, their intention from the start was to focus on the priorities and goals of local leaders and bring together local decision makers in a collaborative learning process, investigating the questions of top concern to these communities. For this reason, I am especially delighted that we will be hearing today from the local leaders of both real-time scaling labs. We have a chance to learn directly from their experiences and reflect on how we might use their valuable insights to inform how we reach more children with quality education and lifelong learning opportunities. To conclude, if we're going to make a difference for peace and prosperity around the world and truly invest in the future of our planet, we need to move beyond each trying to solve a small corner of this problem on our own. Truly working together towards transformative change, learning from and building on each other's experiences, following the evidence to inform decisions and leveraging diverse voices and perspectives will help to ensure millions more children have access to quality education. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm going to try to share my screen. Right now, Dan, it's saying it's disabled my screen sharing, but I think it's coming on now. No, it's saying that it is still disabled. Let's see. There we go. Fantastic. Nothing like the technology in these events. Wonderful. Well, the impetus really for these two reports and for the scaling labs overall is that while there are many effective education innovations around the world, the vast majority only reach a small fraction of the children in need. As a result, there is growing demand for both more evidence and practical guidance on how to identify, adapt, and scale policies and practices that lead to millions more children learning. In response, at CUE, we've been exploring efforts to scale and sustain evidence-based initiatives that are leading to large-scale improvements in children's learning. Most recently, we've been doing this over the past 3 years alongside a number of partners as part of these real-time scaling labs. The real-time scaling labs are a participatory action research approach implemented in partnership with local institutions in several countries to collaboratively learn from, document, and support efforts to scale or expand and deepen impact in education. We're doing this through accompanying evidence-based initiatives that are in the process of scaling, bringing together diverse partners to collaboratively learn about the scaling process, with the aim to feed this learning directly back into the initiatives, as well as to draw transferable lessons that can be shared with the broader education community. Currently, there are 6 real-time scaling labs around the world with intentional diversity in terms of thematic focus, geographic location, the scaling approach that's being taken, where they're currently at in the scaling process, as well as a degree of government engagement. Today, we have the privilege to share findings from 2 of these labs with additional reports from the other labs published over the next 2 years. I'll start with a very brief overview of the 2 initiatives of focus. The first one, in collaboration with Transforming Education in Coca Communities, or TREC, and the Ministry of National Education and Literacy, we launched a scaling lab in Cote d'Ivoire in early 2019, focused on the adaptation and expansion of the program d'enseignement ciblé, or PEC. You can see why we're very fortunate to have a French interpreter with us. PEC is an adaptation of the teaching at the right level educational approach, originally developed by Pratham in India and currently being adapted to many countries around the world, including Cote d'Ivoire. The focus is on building early grade foundational skills in both reading and math by grouping children together according to their learning needs rather than by age or grade, along with continuous assessment and interactive and child-centered approaches. PEC is currently being delivered by the government in 1,000 schools, with the government's goal to reach 100% of students in grade 3 through 6 through the existing system. In Tanzania, we launched a scaling lab in 2018 with CAMFED in collaboration with the Ministry of Education, Science, and Technology and the President's Office of Regional Administration and Local Government. This lab focused on the process of implementing, adapting, and scaling the Learner Guide program, which delivers life skills curriculum and mentorship provided by recent female secondary school graduates, known as Learner Guides, to secondary school students as part of an 18-month-long volunteer program. In return for their service, these Learner Guides receive skills training, interest-free loans for their businesses, and an internationally recognized qualification. CAMFED has trained more than 2,000 young women to be Learner Guides, reaching more than 44,000 secondary students, with the goal to reach 1 million girls in Tanzania through national adoption and delivery by 2025. There's a lot more information on both of these initiatives, including their impact to date in the reports. Each of these reports capture in detail the story of scaling these two initiatives to date, looking at critical factors, opportunities, and challenges, as well as transferable lessons for others grappling with similar issues related to scaling and systems change. Despite some important differences, certainly between these cases, I'll briefly discuss just a few of the shared findings. The first shared finding is the importance of focusing on who will deliver and finance at scale from the start, and considering how roles will evolve over time. Moving from government acceptance of an initiative to government ownership is a complex and long-term process. Part of planning for scale, certainly starting with responding to local needs, also involves co-designing and engaging with those early on who will ultimately be responsible for delivering and financing an initiative. Both experiences underscored how working with the government from any initial phase is critical, how it fosters buy-in, determines what's feasible, and demonstrates potential for the solution to work within the existing system. In Cote d'Ivoire, this started with the ministry selecting PEC from a portfolio of evidence-based education initiatives that were originally sourced by a funder, TREC, initiatives that aligned with national priorities and responded to local needs. While it wasn't guaranteed that the government was going to scale PEC in the pilot phase, as they were simultaneously testing other options, piloting through the government meant they could not only test the effectiveness of the approach in Cote d'Ivoire, but also see how it might get integrated into the government systems if proven effective. When the independent results of the PEC pilot were available, the ministry chose to move forward with expanding its implementation based on its promising results, and then use the next phases to further test this integration and make necessary adaptations. An important lesson learned from Tanzania is that during a scaling process, especially one transitioning from an NGO-led to a government-led intervention, roles and responsibilities necessarily shift over time. Certain activities that innovators, such as CAMFED, took on in the pilot stages or in the early stages, gradually transition to the purview of those delivering at larger scale. This requires not only the innovator's openness to change, or what our colleague in Cote d'Ivoire refers to as scaling without ego, but also forward planning to really identify and consider how roles will evolve over time, including those of the innovators and what they might assume, such as ongoing research and development functions. A second set of findings relate to the need to pay close attention to scalability in the local context, including an initiative's simplicity and alignment to the existing system. While it might be tempting to seek innovations that significantly disrupt existing ways of working or test cutting edge technologies, these cases highlight how critical it is to focus on the practicality of scaling and innovation in a particular context. We've often found the innovations with the most potential for large impact are those that are most feasible for the system to bear. Both labs underscored how scaling decisions are not solely based on the efficacy of the innovation, certainly impact is critical, but also its ability to be scaled with impact and sustained in the system. In Cote d'Ivoire, PEC's relative simplicity and similarity with existing teacher training made it more attractive to key stakeholders, facilitating its adoption into the existing system. PEC's scaling pathway in the system was also relatively straightforward, as it focused on teaching practices in the classroom, which meant that it was under the purview of a single ministry, and the pathway to integration was relatively clear. The experience in Tanzania highlighted how part of scalability is balancing what is core to an initiative's impact and should be maintained during expansion, with an openness to flexible adaptation required to respond to new and changing context, new data, and in the case of the Learner Guide program, most importantly, important feedback directly from the learner guides themselves, students, and teachers. CAMFED and partners have determined what are the core elements of the Learner Guide program that should remain as the program scales, such as relying on young female volunteers from local communities to deliver the life skills program. At the same time, they've identified aspects of the program that schools and communities should tailor to their own contexts, such as where the life skills sessions fall within the school day or which grade levels to include in the sessions. This balance of keeping the core and adapting the rest has helped to support the scalability of the Learner Guide program within many different local contexts. A critical component of scalability is understanding costs of implementing an initiative and how these costs might change as an initiative scales, as well as how those costs compare to the existing education budgets. Cost data and analyses are critical for informing decisions about scaling, including to make the case for investment to government stakeholders, to plan for scale, and explore opportunities for cost efficiencies and necessary adaptations to potentially lower costs. However, we found that sufficiently detailed cost data are often not collected about education initiatives, and there's a widespread lack of knowledge of how to conduct cost analyses and project costs at scale. In both of these cases, questions related to the costs of scaling the particular initiatives were requested from the government and lab members, and costed scaling plans were developed to guide and inform scaling decisions in both of the real-time scaling labs. In Tanzania, for example, the development of a costed scaling plan identified the Learner Guide program's primary cost drivers, as well as potential economies of scale or areas for cost savings as it expands, as well as where and how elements of the program could transition from external financing to become part of the existing government budget. A fourth and final finding is that while government engagement in the scaling process is critical for expanding and sustaining an education initiative, especially where the focus is on institutionalization or embedding into the government system, this does not mean the government can or should do it alone. Collective action is required, bringing diverse actors together, bringing their different perspectives, resources, expertise, and roles. In addition to the key parts played by innovators and governments, both of these cases also highlighted the important role of intermediaries in the scaling process. Third parties who play a connective role between innovators and large-scale deliverers, often supporting overlooked functions in the scaling process, such as strategic planning, evaluation and documentation, and convening and coordination. In Cote d'Ivoire, a consortium of funders from philanthropy purposely brought together innovators, government, and private sector stakeholders to create a portfolio of actors with different risk tolerances and capacity at various stages of implementation, adaptation, and scaling. TREC itself played a critical intermediary role to align incentives, develop innovative approaches to leverage the unique strengths and perspectives of each actor, and gather stakeholders together behind a shared goal of improving learning outcomes. This partnership approach helped support PEC's expansion and brought together the strengths of a variety of actors to support the government's scaling efforts. At the same time, questions remain around how to balance the need for partnerships with the reality that overly complex or mismatched partnerships can significantly hinder the process. Both experiences underscored that sufficient attention must be paid early on to clarify each partner's motivation and incentives, value addition, visions of scaling and success, and risk tolerance. As I've started to share, and I hope that you'll read further in both of these reports, while these initiatives have achieved considerable scaling success to date, the journey is far from over. Both of these experiences reinforce how scaling is a long-term process of continuous learning, adaptation, and improvement. And I certainly believe there is much for us in the global education community to continue to learn from their future efforts. We now have the pleasure to hear from our distinguished panelists to discuss some of these findings further. Please remember to select a language channel from the global icon at the bottom of your screen, as part of this conversation will take place in French. I will briefly introduce our four speakers and invite you to read their full and impressive bios online on the event page on the Brookings website. So we are joined first by Barbara Chalangwa, who is the Executive Advisor with CAMFED Zambia, the Tanzania Real-Time Scaling Lab Advisor, and former Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Education in Zambia. Larry Cooley is President Emeritus at Management Systems International and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Fostan Kofi is an Inspector General at the Ministry of National Education and Literacy in Cote d'Ivoire and the Cote d'Ivoire Real-Time Scaling Lab Manager. And Asif Salih is the Executive Director with BRAC. I now would like to invite all four of our panelists to please join me on the screen. I'll ask each of our panelists a series of questions, which include some advanced questions that we've received from the audience. I'd like to invite the entire audience to please continue posing questions and conversations on Twitter at #MillionsLearning, and we'll do our best to respond to them during the panel or after the event. So please join me on the screen. Fantastic. If you want to turn your videos on.
Jenny, I seem to need permission to do that.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Fantastic. Wonderful. Well, it goes without saying, I wish we were having this conversation together in person. It feels like a gathering of old friends, and unfortunate to be doing it over video, but hopefully one day very soon. So I'd like to start with this theme of planning for scale from the start, even before there's any guarantee that an initiative is going to go to scale. So I'd like to begin by asking Fostan a question, if I may. Could you speak a bit to how scale was considered early on while you were piloting PEC, and how the government has really been engaged from the start, and any lessons learned to date on the role that you see that pilots can play in scaling?
Merci, Jenny. Merci.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. In Côte d'Ivoire, we did experience some difficulties because for several years, when it came to international assessments that we carried out, the level of our children was very, very low, therefore. So we needed to tackle this question. And with this approach that we were experiencing, we decided to choose the one with the best result. And this is why we had several partners with us. And there was a whole large ecosystem, which is very useful when you need to find solutions. You need partners who ask you to go somewhere else and see somewhere else. And this is why we look at the Indian example, what was going on in India with the targeted learning. And we thought if it works out in India, we asked them, how do you do it? And it kind of clicked for us. We began because it doesn't mean it's going to work in everywhere and in Ivory Coast schools. So we started with a pilot phase, and then we began to think, how can we expand and scale up if we have positive results? So while we were going through, we saw it was necessary. We needed to adjust. We needed to be flexible. So we had to go through several stages. Otherwise, we would have had failed. If we wanted to take the risk to initially go nationally, it would have failed. So basically, with the piloting phase, it enables us to tackle the challenges one by one, gradually, and to get rid of some challenges and make some corrections. And it's clear that today we are not scaling up completely. However, for the pilot phase, we are at the stage of 1,000 schools. So we're doing well with the process. So this is what I can give you as an overview. And if there are other details which are needed, I'm absolutely available for you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fostan. And really helpful to hear about that multi-phased approach that the government and partners took. Because sometimes I think we think there's a pilot, it demonstrates good results, and then we go automatically to scale. And not to steal your thunder, Larry, but I know you often caution us 1 foot on the pedal, 1 foot on the brakes, and make sure we're not scaling too fast and learning along the way. So I'd like to turn to you, Barbara, if I may, approaching this from the side of the organization that originally developed the innovation. How has CAMFED's role changed throughout the process of scaling the Learner Guide program in Tanzania? And what have been both perhaps some of the successes and challenges faced?
Thank you very much, Jenny, for the opportunity to speak on this panel. The scaling journey has been very much a learning curve for CAMFED, with its roles shifting gradually from being the team leader to that of team player, paving the way for the lab to guide the scaling process. The wealth of expertise created by the bringing together of a wide range of stakeholders, comprising high-level representatives from government, civil service organizations like coalitions, the private sector, resulted in decisions based on their collective expertise and informed by stakeholder feedback and agreed action. Together, we explored learner guide synergies with existing government programs and identified entry points for integration. In the process, we fine-tuned the model, making adjustments along the way, including with which core elements of the program to retain and which ones to defer so as to not derail the scaling efforts. Along the way, we have scored a good number of successes, among them getting sustained commitment from lab members and from a cross-section of key government ministries and institutions, and creating champions. The buy-in from government leadership resulted in the invitation from the Commissioner of Morogoro, a non-Comfort district, to introduce the learner guide in schools there. And a request from the Ministry of Education, Science and Technology to submit a concept note on how to integrate the learner guide program, possibly in the Safe Space program or in EQUIP, supported by the World Bank. But there were a number of challenges as well. We experienced some of them. Among them, the non-commitment of funds for the learner guide scaling by the government, and the bureaucracy of government, sometimes delaying the process of moving forward. But with some of our partners being reluctant to make commitment and to agree on decisions. So that's how far I go for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. On that point that you made about fine-tuning the approach and it not being sort of a one-time effort, but something that's happening continuously, I'd love to just stick with that for a moment and ask you a follow-up question, if I may. You know, we've talked quite a bit so far about the critical role of government, as well as the shifting role of the implementing organization that might have originated in innovation. But we know that one essential element for planning for scale from the start is to develop programs and policies that students or parents or teachers actually want, not just say what the government or implementers or funders think that they need. And I know this is core to the Learner Guide program and all of CAMFED work, how strongly grounded it is within communities. So we've received a related question from Susan from Child to Child, who asks about how scaling models take into account the need for local responses. And so it'd be great to hear a little bit from you, Barbara, about how the Learner Guide has sort of balanced maintaining the core elements of the program with this openness to flexible adaptation and responding to changing environments and needs. Oh, you're on mute, Barbara.
Yes, thank you for that question, Jenny. The Learner Guide program is actually a generic program, having been home and grown based on local needs and addressing local problems. And in fact, generally all CAMFED programs are built based on community ownership and bottom-up implementation structures. It is a unique program in the sense that it is delivered by girls who share their lived experiences from with local girls and young women. They link marginalized girls to social support and services and become role models and leaders of change. I know you said a little bit about this already in your remarks, Jenny, but I just wanted to underscore that as well. This, we believe, is our strength and the more reason our programs are such a great success. It is these values and principles embedded in the Learner Guide program that we in CAMFED want to maintain, lest we dilute impact. So, however, evolving context and in line with our strategic imperatives of reaching 5 million girls in the next 5 years, flexibility and adaptation are inevitable as we strive to grow. Through the real-time scaling up process, we have underscored the need for core components of the Learner Guide program to be maintained while keeping the other elements flexible. The scaling process has also helped to identify the role that CAMFED partners can play and maintain that for scaling, such as strengthening institutional capacity, training of trainers, and maintaining a quality in the program to ensure that it's not diluted. And our recent experiences during the COVID pandemic, when schools were closed, for example, we saw how the learner guides stepped in immediately and began to use alternative methods of delivering the learner guide. They used radio programs, for example, in local languages. They distributed printed teaching and learning materials to schools to help them get engaged throughout the closure. Here was an example of how it becomes necessary in certain circumstances to divert a little bit from your normal way of doing things to accommodate the changing circumstances. Thank you. Thank you, Jen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Barbara. Larry, I'd love to turn to you now. Barbara and Fostan were speaking a bit about the critical role of those responsible for large-scale delivery, as well as those originating or innovating an initiative. But I'd wonder if you talk a little bit about the role that intermediaries can play, that sort of cross-pollination role between the two. And from your experience, some constructive role that they've played and what that's looked like.
Well, thanks, Jenny. And it's a pleasure to be on a panel with people that I not only like, but admire so much. You know, this intermediation issue has been close to my heart for a long time, and it's close to my heart for what you might call a negative reason. We were listening to two cases, and when we hear from Asif, we'll hear an amazing case where things have gone to scale and have done that successfully and carefully and thoughtfully. Unfortunately, that's not the norm. My own guesstimate is about 5% of proven innovations ever make it to scale. So you might say, well, how come the other 95 don't and those 5 do? And unfortunately, it's not because the 5% that scale are necessarily the best innovations. They're the ones that have had a good innovation plus some other things. And those other things are what I've come to call intermediation. Let me try to unpack that a little bit. If you've got good innovation going on, and I would say in education and in the world, we have quite robust systems for generating innovation. And we have delivery systems in education, mostly the public schools, and they're functioning. We have enrollments and so on. Why aren't those innovations finding their way into schools? And I think it's because of the absence of certain kinds of functions that are in typical situations, nobody's job. The people doing the innovation don't have the job to carry it across. The people running the schools don't have the ability sometimes to reach back. And so you've got things that would be wonderful, but they don't ever have the chance to be wonderful. And what are those kinds of functions that I'm talking about? I'm talking about things like convening the different parties. When it's not a clear bureaucracy, how do you bring everybody together to do their respective parts and agree on the goals and the respective roles? What about funding? Who's supposed to negotiate and package this for funding? If you're fortunate, you've got an organization like BRAC that has the standing to pull these things together. Most countries don't have that. So how does that come together? Then there are things like change management. Who's managing this process in the way Fostan and Barbara were talking about? And regrettably, those functions, nobody seems to want to fund. They're not the innovation, they're not the delivery. They're the things that bring the innovation into the delivery system. And so as this unfolds over a 15-year period or so, which is how long scaling takes, the question is, how do these functions continue to be performed credibly, intelligently, thoughtfully by somebody who's not trying to seize power, but trying to bring together the components that are necessary to succeed? In the two cases that you've just highlighted, I think that was done unusually well. And I think, I'm not saying this because I'm talking to you, I think the real-time scaling lab played a real function in trying to do that. In the case of Tanzania, it absolutely began with CAMFED. If they hadn't had credibility in the country, this would never have happened. But also if they hadn't brought in Brookings and some other pieces to make this happen and assembled a really broad stakeholder group and held it together and had government take growing control, it wouldn't have happened. In Ivory Coast, it wouldn't have happened without Trek and Jacobs. But in that case, they were blessed by a strong relationship with government from the beginning. So in a sense, they started one step ahead of Tanzania in that regard, but it's no small task to try and bring this together and hold it together over time. I hope not just we today, but the development community will continue to worry about how that function is performed and how those who are funding from outside can help support it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Larry. Asif, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. And we actually received a question from Saeed from Citizen Foundation Pakistan, who asks about scaling quality education innovations in low resource settings. And I know this notion of scaling simple and frugal innovations really has been core to BRAC's work for many years. So great to hear any lessons around balancing impact and scalability. Certainly don't need to be at odds, but there are real trade-offs, we know, including the types of adaptations that BRAC's had to consider to achieve impact, sustainability, and equity.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and great to be here with stalwarts like Larry and others. Fantastic panel. I think I just want to, before I answer that, I just want to touch upon what Larry ended with, just to kind of for the continuity. I think there are multiple pathways to scale, right? So, and what Larry said, that how come these good innovations actually don't end up in public school system? And that is, I think, because of lack of incentives, right? In the end of the day, for public bureaucracy, there's plenty of punishment if things don't go well, but no reward for innovation. So I think that is a fundamental challenge. So that people become a lot less, I guess, they're a lot more risk averse. And that's essentially more and more what we are seeing, that the scaling pathway can be an intermediary, like we have done in Bangladesh, that we can go out and do it ourselves, and then sort of advocate with the government that this is a great model, look at the cost, do you want to take this on, versus doing it together from the beginning and slowly convincing the government over a period of time. I mean, I think the first one, I think the best part of first one is that there's speed, but it's very difficult to convince government at the latter, if you bring them on latter part. Second part is obviously it's a much slower process, but more sustainable over a long time period. And essentially, when we design any model, like we did, for example, our one-room school model in the 90s, one of the big focus was that we didn't really compromise on the impact bit. When we had first started with 22 schools, and we really we got the best curriculum designers, we got the best sort of trainers from around the world. The point was that how do we sort of completely in a different pedagogy move from rote learning and also model something which is flexible, adaptable, because end of the day, in low resource setting, a lot of the issues are connected to people's day-to-day challenges. So we asked families that, why don't you send your kid to school? And they gave very practical reasons. And we just addressed those reasons and said that, okay, so timing is an issue, so let's become flexible. Distance is an issue, so let's move from infrastructure, not an infrastructure heavy model, to a one-room model. Then we don't understand what the teachers are teaching it, so let's have parents-teachers meetings. So we addressed on one hand the practical challenges for the model, but had a very ambitious agenda with the pedagogy. But then when we did the pilot, because we started with the motto that we will scale it up in a big way, then at the pilot stage, we really started trimming the sort of the non-essential elements. And that's where I think that cost element comes in, that how do you do this ambitious thing and start to cost it down and at a very sort of high impact delivery, but at a low cost. And that's where I think also there's another science comes in. And essentially that means that bring in a lot of the community capital, social capital in the model, that people want to do it because they feel that this is good for the community. And this is actually makes the impact a lot more sustainable, right? So our teachers have been these women who were educated in high school with a high school degree, but was not doing anything. They were housewives. So they got capacitated, they got trained, and the mothers feel safer with their daughters going to these schools where these aunts who are their teachers. And so that essentially, so that meant that they were fine doing this part-time thing because they were doing it a lot more for their social status rather than for the element of cost or fees. And there's a different kind of commitment there. So all of these, I think, are brought in. I mean, that essentially makes it a lot more scalable and sustainable over long term.
Thanks so much, Asif. Maybe Barbara, just on that community capital point, again, I know this has certainly been central to Learner Guide and this notion of thinking about all different types of incentives for these volunteer young women, including some of the intrinsic motivation that Asif spoke about, increased social standing in the communities. Any thoughts there on how, we sort of think about scaling that sort of community capital piece of the puzzle?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Asif, for referring to social capital, because that is really the core of the Learner Guide program that we're running. The fact that the young women that we support through school go back to their communities and begin to serve their communities by they themselves supporting other children, by them delivering the Learner Guide sessions. They are contributing to the growth of their community, but they're also being role models there. They've lived there, they've grown there. They are recent graduates. They're trusted by their communities, and they definitely living as an example of what is possible when young women get educated and go back and serve in their communities. They also are all the time connecting other vulnerable children to social services in the communities, thereby helping to fill the gap that is left by government and other stakeholders who are focusing more of their time on structured teaching in the schools. That gap that is left around the social needs of the community is what the Learner Guide and other CAMA members, alumni of CAMFED, are helping to provide in the local communities.
Thanks so much, Barbara. Fostan, I talked a little bit in the presentation about how both labs undertook this costed scaling plan exercise, sort of identifying potential scaling scenarios and then costing those out, really in the case of Cote d'Ivoire at the request of the government. It would be great to hear from you any key insights from that process of developing those costed scenarios and how you might be using that information going forward.
Merci, Jenny.
Thank you, Jenny. I'd like to come back a bit on what Saleh said on the question of motivation and in a process. The thing that we had in the laboratory, that we had many stakeholders, it permits that during the discussions, we understand and admit the necessity to go towards certain decisions, the one to motivate certain actors to deploy it on the field. Otherwise, maybe we would not have understood that necessity. But the fact that all the ecosystem lives its reality during the exchanges, it permits to go forward to better understand certain orientation we can take during decision making. So to come back on the question of costs, we understood after the first, the pilot phase of 50 skills, which was an ideal situation, that if we add to go to 1,000 and more schools, it would be complicated to do in the conditions that we started for the pilot phase. So it would be an utopia to think that the schools of Ivory Coast could go everywhere in the same conditions already. And we also understood that by evolving, there's an improving of our process itself. There's some things we can eliminate and things we can improve. And then we understood also that you must not believe that it's necessary to go fast, but mainly, we have to go at a pace that guarantees the quality of the results that we want. This doing, we said also, to determine how to call the government to follow what we started as a process, because we have to say it. You cannot think that we can go to scale counting only on our partners. So it must be an engagement of the government, and the government, was going to say, is a mechanism that doesn't want to spend. They never want to spend, but we have to convince them. And it's on the basis of simulation that we were able today to bring the director of cabinet of the Prime Minister of Ivory Coast to understand that the process that we engage could be sustained by Ivory Coast because we go for targets. So we elaborated a plan to scaling and its realization. The costs were not automatically determined, but on time and on a programmation. So we had to take into account all the parameters, the metrics that could play on these costs, so there would be real costs and costs that could be mastered. So that's what I want to say on financing. We had to find a mechanism to have the good spendings and make it so that both the partners that follow us and the government understand that we can realize we can obtain quality as taking into account certain elements that have been identified and targeted. That's what I can say on the question of costs. And today, with what we've realized as work, the government is willing to accompany us efficiently so that the teaching program targeted can be widened to all the schools of Ivory Coast.
Thanks so much, Fostan. I remember being so struck by conversations with you, talking about how much, in some ways, the process of bringing together the various government ministries and development partners was as important in some ways as the costing analysis that emerged, in terms of just really thinking about the key assumptions, as you shared. Will we scale in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? What will the training look like? All of those different aspects in the conversations that were had. On your point, Fostan, about financing and certainly bringing along external financing as well. Larry, I'd love to turn to you first and then Asif as well. Maybe if you could both speak a little bit about, even when scaling ambitions align, just thinking about external financing now, even when scaling ambitions align with funders' priorities, we know at times the way that funding is structured can inadvertently undermine perhaps some of those shared scaling goals. And so I'm curious what trends you're both seeing. I'll start with Larry and then turn to you, Asif. What trends you're seeing in terms of external financing and support of scaling, perhaps for better or for worse. So Larry, if I could start with you, and then any as well, I just ask you any recommendations you might have for the funding community.
I'll be brief, but I have a lot I would want to say about this. So let me just try to hit a couple of fine points if I could. One is that governments and donors seem to think differently about the funding analysis and the funding equation. And it really is a product of both the accountability requirements that donors have to their stakeholders, and also the fact that the project modality tends to be 1, 3, 5 years in length. In those, when you bundle that way and you report that way, you tend to focus on the direct effects of the project and try to look at things like cost return on that investment, as opposed to the contribution of the project to a longer term change process, which has more indirect and longer term effects. The donors, I'm convinced, can do better on this even within their current constraints, and some are really trying hard, really trying hard. If you read the latest GPE strategy, it's an honest effort to reach in that direction, and a number of others are really, I can feel them struggling with the problem, but it's very unresolved. That would be point number one. The second thing is the governments, as everybody on the call probably knows, are super constrained. Now, they were constrained before, and COVID has made it worse. And so basically anything which can't even, it's not close to budget neutral is going to have a problem. So if it's coming in and it costs money, if possible, it should show where it's offsetting an expense somewhere else. If not, it needs to make a very strong case for why the incremental funding, even if it's a high return on investment. Sorry, I'm chasing my dog away. Even if it's a very high return on investment, is going to be difficult for the government to digest because they're going to have to displace something else to do that. So that takes a very intimate conversation with the government, maybe less with the Ministry of Education and more with the Ministry of Finance. The third thing I would say is that I'm surprised and very impressed with the potential role of philanthropy and collective philanthropy on this. The usual role, historical role of philanthropy is to fill gaps where the government can't do things. So there's some unserved population or some special need. It still does that. But in addition, in several of these cases, it's played a really important role in doing the things that official donors are not good at doing, taking a longer term perspective, maybe doing program funding rather than project funding, maybe being part of a pooled resource, or even being the syndicator that brings the pool together in the first place. So I think there's a real important emerging area here for philanthropy, working with host country governments and with international donors in trying to make this a more effective package. But I would agree with your premise and Julia's at the beginning that this is still work very much in progress, and there's a lot more that's needed.
Thanks, Larry. Asif, can I turn it to you?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Larry has covered most of the things that but I would just add that I think overall with the whole sort of, I would say, constraint on financing as a whole, and also government being very choosy about what projects that they want to do. I think we need to, as intermediaries and other implementers, it's part of a self-reflection that we need to understand government mechanisms and systems much better than we have done in the past. Because I think a lot of projects and proposals gets developed. We don't understand the processes well enough in terms of where to intervene, when to intervene. I think that wasn't a problem before because financing was very much available, and we could do a lot of things that we could do at scale. But I think we are kind of also stepping back as financing has been scaled down, and we have to understand these mechanisms much better. Second thing is also, I think, in countries like ours, in low resource countries, there is essentially a huge element of understanding of individuals and personalities. That's very, very important within the government systems. And we have recently started a work with the government actually financing some of our work, which is a game changer. But this is a starting point. But again, this has been a very collaborative process after a long time. So I absolutely echo with Larry that whoever is the financier, whether it's philanthropist or a bilateral government, I think this short-term 3-year, 5-year project, it doesn't work. It takes a long time to have depth, to have sustainability, to have a sort of system changing ability. So I would suggest that bank on an intermediary and then support them for the long term for depth. I think that's very, very important going forward. And last but not the least, I think we have seen a lot of benefit of things like real-time scaling labs, right? So connecting our research partner as things are scaling, as a feedback, and along with the quick feedback loop that Barbara mentioned before, is so important because I think often quality is diluted, but at the same time, you are continuously being asked, so what, the so what question. So what? Because I think there is a tendency of intermediaries to get down into too much into the activities without asking that so what question. So I think it's very, very important. And I think part of the success for these two projects has been because you guys were involved as well. So I think we have seen that not only in education, recently in COVID response, we involved IPA in one of our projects for mask. You probably have heard about the mask research that happened in Bangladesh, and we really benefited from it. So this focus on practice versus not so much on publication actually helps us and also the researchers to be far more grounded and be effective in scaling. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Asif. Well, we're short on time, which pains me, and I want to make sure to give a final word to Barbara and then Fostan. So maybe I'll just sort of leave it a bit open to you both. Any sort of final reflections or recommendations that you would share with us of what you've learned through scaling both the Learner Guide program and the PEC initiative?
Thank you, Jenny, for that. Thank you, Jenny, for that opportunity to just say a few words as we begin to conclude. First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge what Larry and Asif have said around availability of government funding and how difficult it is for governments to fund innovations. We are all experiencing problems of shrinking budgets, especially for education, and even with successful innovations like our Learner Guide program, we all realize that the best way to scale into government system is to try and find, I think, areas that of existing government programs where to fit in our program so that we are not requesting governments to create new budget lines for our program. So that is the focus that even the Learner Guide is taking at the moment. But also to just reflect that for me, the most successful aspect of the Scaling Lab in Tanzania has been the bringing together of this body of stakeholders who normally operate in silos in their own ministries. And yet they are dealing with issues that cut across several ministries. So my advice would be, let's, as much as possible, try and create cross-cutting, multi-sectoral forums where we, as stakeholders, discuss possibilities of bringing quality education to the system, so that at least it can benefit everybody, and also that our resources that are available in our sector ministries can be used collaboratively to increase on the impact of the work that we do. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be part of this panel.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And having had the privilege to participate in some of those forums that CAMFED and the government convened, I couldn't agree more, seeing the sort of rich exchange between different sectors and ministries, and really in an effort for us all to break out of our silos. So Fostan, please, over to you for some final words of wisdom, scaling wisdom for us.
Oui, merci Jenny.
Yes, thank you, Jenny. Yes, certainly. I would like to say, first of all, the opportunity of these labs in Côte d'Ivoire enable us to understand the meaning that school belongs to communities. But this community has to be participative to the schools. And the exchanges we've had around the table in the framework of our work and of our discussions for the labs gave this opportunity for each stakeholder to intervene, to speak up. And I want to say that for Ivory Coast, for these labs, we had NGOs, we had international organizations, the World Bank, some industries, some trade unions. And there was a whole range of representatives of this community. Therefore, our exchanges, our discussions allowed everybody to understand what is the role we were able to play to support schools. And at the end of the day, we understand, as said my colleague, the government is absolutely crucial, and philanthropy is there to support us. And the philanthropy comes with all the questions that have to be tackled as well. As a lesson, we need to do things, start small, And we do not need to go too fast. We need to be patient. We need to be flexible. And we need to be able to adapt. And for Côte d'Ivoire, we started with this Indian model, and maybe it would have been relevant, but however, it was not perfect. We needed to adapt, to adjust. And this is what we learned with these labs. We gave the opportunity to each actor to be able to express himself and to take into consideration what had to be eliminated, what had to be adopted. And with all the team, all this ecosystem that we constituted, we were able to have such results. And nowadays, I want to say that we have a clearer idea about how to have an approach, such approach. With this initiative, it's very clear about what we should think about scaling. And the scaling is built from the beginning of the initiative. We need to take into consideration the data, all the information. And when it comes to costs, there were details we didn't take into consideration for the first year, you know, and we understood that this information was very important. When it comes to data, you cannot build anything without the data. So therefore, it's very important for any initiative to take data into consideration. It was a fantastic opportunity for us to talk about Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Faustin. Again, I think we just scratched the surface, and I apologize we weren't able to get to the many questions that we received, but we do plan to follow up in a blog, and we'll try to respond to as many of them as we can. I'm going to turn it over to Senior Fellow Brad Olson now to give concluding remarks. And I just want to really thank all of our panelists, not only for sharing these insightful and honest reflections, but really for your commitment and your willingness to allow us to learn alongside you as we're all trying to navigate these complexities of scaling. So thank you all so much. Brad, over to you, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jenny, so much for this opportunity. Gosh, there's so much that I could say. There's so many interesting things that I heard, but I know I only have a couple of minutes. And so maybe I will just begin by sharing a couple of reflections that sort of underscore the principles of effective scaling. One of the things is how important it is to tailor the innovation and the approach to the existing context, to the unique strengths and characteristics of the local context in which the innovation is being adapted. Not only does the innovation itself need to be adapted for the context, but then as it's being embedded in the location, it will continually be embedded and adapted at the same time. I think about Barbara's comments about the life skills aspect of the learner guides and how important it would be that those life skills are tailored to the specific population in each location of girls. A second thing that I think is really important is that it's come up about how scaling and adaptation and innovations need to be responsive to the local communities in the sense that we should be listening always to people on the ground. Asif's point about listening to parents becomes incredibly important. At the end of the day, it's the people on the ground who are going to accept or reject the education innovation. And so it seems to me to be particularly important to start with them and listening to them and their needs, and to make sure to include them all the way through, and to make sure that they understand how the innovation, how the new educational approach is going to benefit them and their children. Because if they don't understand that, they're not going to accept it. And if it's not accepted, then the whole thing will fall apart. I want to say something quickly about research. What I'm hearing today reminds me how important it is that we conduct inductive research on the processes of scaling and not just process product studies or impact evaluations. We want to learn about the process of scaling as a complex sort of ecological process, not just test the effectiveness of the innovations. And then finally, as I reflect on what's been said and the importance of everything over the last hour, I'm reminded of the usefulness of a lab approach like what has been talked about today. This is a focus on research that is useful for actual practice and practice that's informed by research. And so this is about learning by doing, but it's also about doing by learning. Learning and scaling is a long-term process. It's very complicated, but we would hope that each generation of scaling, each set of projects improves upon what came before. It's incredibly challenging work, but it's also gratifying in this way in which it's focused on success and it's focused on slowly but solidly improving education for the children and adults who need it most. It seems to me that that is about the most important thing about it all. And listening today to these efforts reminded me that we are continuing to improve our efforts. In the last minute, I'd like to tell you that there are a couple of next steps from Millions Learning. We will continue to implement the real-time scaling labs with our local partners, learning from and learning alongside them. Specifically, the real-time scaling lab in Tanzania is transitioning to a new phase in which the scaling lab partner, CAMFED, whom you've heard about, is taking the real-time scaling lab approach and moving it forward with government colleagues, as well as adapting and bringing the approach to other countries in sub-Saharan Africa where they work. In Cote d'Ivoire, the real-time scaling lab is also entering a new phase with increased government leadership and institutionalization of the process and expansion of its scope. More real-time scaling lab case studies will be published in the upcoming years, focusing on labs in Botswana and Jordan. A seminal report will be coming out to look at across cases in 2023. And in the meantime, we will continue sharing what we learn. I also want to mention a related project. This is the KICS GPE ROSI project. ROSI stands for Research on Scaling the Impact of Innovations in Education. And this is a project in which we at the CUE are working alongside 15 teams of scalers and researchers who are working in 29 countries. Next week, our first annual reflection brief is coming out, and we will continue to share what we learn in 2022 with these partners. And then finally, I just want to thank on the behalf of CUE, all the folks who made this happen today. Thank you so much to our keynote speaker, the Honorable Julia Gillard. I want to thank these wonderful panelists, Faustin Coffey, Barbara Chilangwa, Asif Salih, and Larry Cooley. Thank you all so much. The whole CUE team that made this event possible, our simultaneous interpreters and subtitles translator, all of you for joining today. Thank you so much for all of this. You can find a link to a recording of this event, the 2 full reports, executive summaries, as well as a suite of scaling related tools and resources on the Brookings website. We hope you will please continue to follow the conversation at #MillionsLearning. And again, thank you for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon, evening, and rest of your week. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.